Hey everyone, and welcome to another edition of Seriously Risky Business. My name's Patrick Gray. Seriously Risky Business is the podcast we do here where I sit down and talk with Tom Uren, my colleague, about his analysis of the week. And this podcast is brought to you this week by Thinkst Canary, which makes, hardware honeypots and operates the canarytokens.org service. Everybody loves Thinkst, right? So they're all about the warm and fuzzies, and you can find information about Thinkst Canary at canary.tools. We'd also like to thank the William and Flora Hewlett Foundation, who support the work that Tom does with us, and also Lawfare Media, who syndicate Tom's column for the Lawfare blog and are just generally wonderful people who help us out. But Tom, let's get into this week's discussion. And we've got some follow-up information on the arrest of Pavel Durov, the Telegram chief executive. He was, of course, arrested last week or over the weekend in France and being held while they weighed charges. He's since been bailed. That's the new thing. He's out on bail, but he needs to stay in France and report to police a couple times a week. The French legal system, from what I can gather, is a little bit different to ours in that, he still has not been formally charged, but the investigation has progressed, which indicates that they are moving towards formal charges. Is that about right?
Yeah, that's right. So at this point, they know that there's something they want to investigate. And there's a series of, I guess I'd call them allegations. So there's a couple of reports that talk about exactly what the problem was. And so there's a media report that says that a relatively new office, the Office of Minors, which is responsible for tackling violence against children, basically said the heart of the case is the lack of moderation and CSAM, child sex abuse material on Telegram. And there's another report which talks about in the warrant, which was issued for both Pavel and his brother Nikolai, that the French authorities had issued a court order for the name or the identifiers of a particular Telegram account, and they had done work on that Telegram account. It claimed that the suspect talked about luring underage girls to give him what they called self-produced child pornography, and then threatening to release it onto social media. So really quite disgusting stuff. Yeah,
so this is the sort of sextortion stuff that we see across all social media platforms. I guess the difference being that when something like this happens over Facebook, there's a team there who work with authorities to at least try to identify them so they can be charged.
Yeah. I don't think it's a particularly high bar, right? Like if you've got an account, things like IP addresses or when they created it or email addresses, these are all things you could give to authorities when they ask. But Telegram just didn't respond. So that seems like maybe it was the straw that broke the camel's back, or the instigating incident that sort of encouraged them to actually issue a warrant. Now, Telegram actually has I'd described it as combative attitude to content moderation and law enforcement assistance. So it's FAQ. It actually says we use a distributed architecture, we store data in multiple data centers, and they're controlled by different legal entities. So there's no one court order that we will get that will allow us to give up the data.
It always makes me chuckle when people write stuff like that down on their blog. We designed our service to be resistant to law enforcement, and then they get charged with failing to comply with their legal obligations, and that's Exhibit A. And you just think, why did you? It blows my mind that people write this stuff down.
Yeah. So Telegram's got this difference between what it does and what it says. So it says we've got this marvelous encryption, we're very secure, we do all these things, yet they're actually not really an encrypted messaging app at all. They sort of promote themselves as an encrypted messaging app, but when you compare them to iMessage or Signal or WhatsApp, even Facebook Messenger, those are all nowadays end-to-end encrypted, where the platform itself can't see the content. But
I think there is something a distinction I want to make here, right? So a lot of people think, E2EE is the thing that really presents problems for law enforcement and intelligence. And that is absolutely true because the provider can't cooperate.
Mm-hmm.
But in the case where a provider is not cooperating and they're just offering TLS encryption, like bog standard SSL style encryption, that's still a problem for law enforcement. They cannot capture that information across the wire, right? So they can't do the interception without the provider's cooperation. So as much as we say, oh yeah, Telegram's not operating E2EE, so what's the problem? The problem is they're not cooperating, so it may as well be E2EE.
Yeah.
So really it's just people who have access to that platform, whatever deals Durov's done with whatever governments, because, there certainly is some scuttlebutt that maybe he was cooperating with the Russian government and handing over material there. But I think this E2EE part of this discussion is a bit of a distraction, if I'm completely honest.
I think it's not a distraction in the sense that if you're a law enforcement authority and you say, give me the data, and the company goes, here's all the data we've got. It doesn't include any content because we're end-to-end encrypted. I think that makes a difference. Whereas
Telegram, in this case, they could cough up the data and they're refusing,
exactly.
Which makes it worse. Yeah, no,
Yeah.
I see what you mean. Yeah.
Yeah. So I think that's truly significant because if they were properly end-to-end encrypted, they could just go, here's what we've got, not much, fill your boots. And I think it's that obstructiveness that really puts people offside. And in terms of the judicial system, it probably doesn't make much difference putting people offside. But in terms of how motivated people are to take action, I think it absolutely makes a difference.
Yeah, 100%. So we still really don't quite know how this is going to play out, but I think a few things have become clear, which is that the French authorities were having specific trouble with Telegram in specific instances, specific cases. So I think we can sort of put to bed this idea that this whole thing is sort of somehow politically motivated or part of some game between the French and Russian government because of Ukraine and this and that. I mean, certainly I would expect that Macron would not be displeased by this happening, but it's hard to see that he's explicitly pulling the strings here, right?
Apparently he's a big fan of Telegram and uses it all the time, which, I mean, that's a terrible idea. But
yeah. Well, it's like Australian politicians who love to use WeChat because they can connect with the sort of Chinese diaspora who vote in Australia, right? So I'm guessing it's along those lines.
Well, the story I read was that he uses it to communicate with other cabinet ministers, which I think is a terrible idea.
Oh my God.
WeChat, if you're using it to communicate with constituents, sure, fill your boots. That seems like fair enough. That's kind of what it's for in a way.
Yeah. So, I mean, we've already talked about this a lot on the main show. I mean, the key difference here, the element of the discussion that's different is, he's been bailed, and also looking a little bit more specifically at those charges and, how they came to be. But I mean, what's your feeling, Tom? I'm just curious for your opinion on this as to the appropriateness of this sort of action. Because I feel like in most cases where there's a problem like this, the normal thing that happens is the companies get fined, right? The companies get fined until they can do something. I mean, this might be difficult in the case of Telegram because I'm not sure if it has business operations in France. In which case, I mean, if they don't have business operations in France, I mean, I'd imagine that this is probably the only course of action available to French authorities. Why is it that you think that they've gone straight for the criminal prosecution route here instead of trying another way?
I think my guess is that they've tried different things and they've had no success, and this seems it's the end of the road.
Yeah.
So in I'll use air quote normal app, you'd put court orders in, they would respond, and you may or may not be happy with what they give you, but at least they're playing the game, right? They're going through the motions, they're responding, they're giving the appearance of responding appropriately. But what Telegram, they just didn't play the game. And so when they're not involved in the normal responses that a company gives, you've got to go to an abnormal place to respond. And so I imagine there was actually behind the scenes an escalating, series of efforts to try and get them to respond to these law enforcement requests. And when they go nowhere, what you're left with is, well, you've got to hold the people responsible, you've got to hold them personally responsible, personally accountable. And so I think that's where it's ended up. So I like to sort of contrast it with Signal, where Signal's created this architecture where they can wholeheartedly respond to law enforcement requests, and they do, but they've created a system where they can provide very, very little information. So they'll respond with when the account was created and the last time the account accessed the access signal. So just two date stamps. And so they're, in a way, playing the game. Law enforcement can't go and say they're not responding to requests. They are responding to requests. And the escalation path there is there a way to force Signal to change their service? And I think that's a much higher bar for a legal system to take compared to you have the data, in Telegram's case, we've given you a court order and you're just not responding and you consistently don't respond. And so what are we left to do? We've got to hold someone personally accountable.
Yeah, 100%. I think a big difference between Signal and Telegram as well is that, Telegram is a much more open type of app with discoverable channels and operates a little bit more like a social network, whereas the groups, Signal groups tend to be a little bit more hidden from view, which I think is another difference here. I do think, though, that this is a significant event.
Yes.
That will probably have some consequences for other app makers like Signal down the line, especially should we see, the resurgence of, terrorist campaigns targeting people in the West, like we did see in France with a series of attacks by ISIS. I think the politics around this could really change, and that we might see further action against other apps. Now, whether that's them being banned from app stores, which I think, politicians are sort of reticent to do, or whether it does mean, more arrest warrants for executives and holding them personally responsible, I don't know. But this is the direction that we could be heading in. Look, I want to move on to talking about another story that you covered this week. This is really interesting. This company called Cinder has published a blog post on how you can spot, and based on their own experience, how you can spot North Koreans who are trying to get hired by your company for remote work, which, as we know, is a big issue, particularly in the United States at the moment. And, they send these people in as remote workers, and then they are remote controlling a laptop in someone's basement in like Kentucky or whatever. And of course, a lot of these places are being shut down now. So there is a pretty clear way to combat this particular thing that's going on. But they've come up with a checklist basically of like things that, telltale signs and red flags that someone who's applying to work for your company is actually a North Korean. Walk us through them because they're actually quite funny. And I'd imagine you're going to spot these people with this checklist pretty easily.
Yeah, what I liked is that this checklist is very, very practical. It's not technical at all. And partly it's informed by the company has 2 ex-CIA founders, so human type people. And the person who wrote the blog post has actually been involved in North Korean advocacy, helping refugees and stuff like that for a very long time. So the list includes some fairly straightforward things. So no online presence outside of professional networking websites. So they create a fake LinkedIn or whatever, but they don't go much beyond that. A completely fabricated job history, including office locations that don't exist.
Yeah.
So I guess you have to do your homework, right? Does this location actually exist? No presence on GitHub or social media. Inability to answer basic questions about where they lived or worked. So one question here is, what was your metro stop in Paris?
Yeah. Which train station did you go to, right? And yeah, you would think that would be an easy answer. One of the other ones that you glossed over just earlier, which is their profile pictures tend to obscure their faces, right? So they're like wearing ski goggles or huge sunglasses, or the profile picture is so zoomed out that they're just like a little blob of pixels in the center and stuff, right? So, yeah.
Background noise during their interview. So like they're calling from a call center.
Yeah.
Highly scripted answers with an explicit preference for remote work, and they can't deviate from their script. And a resume that looks like they should speak English very well, but they can't.
Yeah.
So those struck me as very, very practical. Like there's something that you would add no more than a couple of minutes to an interview if you're carrying one out, just a few extra questions and stuff that you would pick up in the process, except for sort of chasing down the job history. So very, very practical. And it's also coupled with usually very vague cover letters. Hi team, hope you're safe.
Yeah.
Really
I mean,
excited.
one of the things I found interesting here, though, is you would have thought that this is a very basic level of due diligence that you would have hoped people were doing already.
Yeah, it is kind of I guess perhaps seeing any one of those by themselves is not a red flag. Like
Yeah.
it's a bit weird, but
Yeah,
seems
some
like
people
a
are
great
private. Like
candidate.
I've got friends who don't have much of a presence on social media, right? And who
That's
don't
right.
like images of their face being out there. But, if they're calling themselves, hi, my name is John David Johnson, but I don't speak English and I can't tell you which, train station I used to get off at,
Yeah. Now,
for
the
work.
other
I
really
don't know.
fascinating thing about this is that once they had this checklist, they went through different job sites and offered positions. And so for some job sites, they said that roughly 80% of inbound applicants looked like they were North Korean based on this checklist.
Yeah.
So it seems like there's a lot of dodgy potential hires out there.
Well, this is what happens when the job market is running hot, right? And you've got to get those applicants in. You're going to get all sorts. We'll wrap it up there. Tom Uren, thank you so much for joining me to talk through your newsletter of the week, Seriously Risky Business, which people can find at news.risky.biz. Great to chat to you, and we'll do it all again next week.
Thanks a lot, Patrick.